June 22nd is the anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's surprise 1941 invasion of his supposed ally, the Soviet Union. And it's a stew of cunning, of stupidity, and of evil with a side of geopolitics. Where do you even start with an event this large? Well, to me, it's the fact that it nearly worked. There was an element of genius to Adolf Hitler, regrettably. And, the Nazi-Soviet Pact, where he made the Soviets his allies in the summer of 1939 that left the West isolated, their geopolitical assumptions in ruins. That was a stroke of brilliance. Turning on a Soviet ally, it certainly didn't work out very well, but it nearly did. And what might the world look like if Soviet resistance had collapsed? Which brings me to the question, how dumb was Stalin not to see this coming? It's one of the great cliches of 20th century history that Stalin, who trusted nobody, who murdered all his own closest associates, somehow was fooled by the Nazi dictator. And I'm here to tell you, it ain't so. Churchill talks about this, having met with Stalin once they became allies and saying, "Why didn't you listen to our warning?" And Stalin said, "Oh, I knew an attack was coming. I just thought I could buy a little more time." And there's substantial evidence to support this point. There's a speech that Stalin gave in February 1931 to a group of industrial managers, and he said, "We are 10 to 50 to 100 years behind the advanced Western nations. We must catch up with them in 10 years or they will crush us." Justifying his forced industrialization policy. Well, Hitler's attack came 10 years and 4 months after that speech. And a lot of people who'd wondered if all the sacrifice was really necessary, and very privately in the Soviet Union, looked at the result of the war and thought, you know what, maybe Stalin did understand. On the other hand, the initial Soviet defenses were stupid. Stalin seized all this buffer territory between 39 and 41 that helped to alienate him from potential allies in the West and proved of no use at all when the war came. The Soviet army was stationed too far to the front. Millions of men, tens of thousands of major weapons were lost in the first weeks of the war. So Stalin almost brought disaster on his own head. At the same time, given his understanding of the world, there was a certain duplicitous genius in the Nazi-Soviet Pact to buy time. Although, as Winston Churchill pointed out, once Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, they were forever being pestered by Molotov, by Stalin, by every Soviet functionary who could grab their lapels, open a second front, open a second front. And Churchill says, well, we had a second front until the fall of France, remember? Which happened because you were Hitler's ally. So back off on this one. Of course, it's also true that although Churchill loathed Bolshevism, he thought it should have been strangled in its cradle, he did make common cause with Stalin without having the kind of illusions about the Soviet dictator that Franklin Roosevelt apparently did. Roosevelt really didn't know what Stalin was. Churchill did. So why make an ally of this man? Well, as he told Parliament, if Hitler should invade hell, I would contrive to make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. And when we think about allying ourselves with doubtful regimes in the world, it is worth remembering that we allied ourselves with a regime that was not doubtful, but loathsome and fully evil during the Second World War in order to defeat another regime that was equally evil and more immediately dangerous to us. So sometimes in the world of geopolitics, you do have to make these kind of decisions. And that brings me to the final point, this peculiar spectacle of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, which stunned the world. Nobody believed that these two sworn enemies could possibly be friends. It was Stalin himself who said that it was hard to explain this sudden reversal of foreign policy to the Soviet people. You wouldn't think that would be a big concern, but he did worry about these things. It's hard to explain how we were suddenly allies with Hitler's regime after we spent years emptying buckets of shit over one another's heads. Stalin did talk like that. It's funny. You sometimes think of him as kind of this grim, gray statue. You forget that he was a man with human attributes, including, here's just a weird side note. Did you know Stalin had perfect pitch? He did. What a thing for that loathsome cockroach to have. But he actually had musical talent and he had perfect pitch. However, he also had extreme evil and a combination of blindness and ruthless cunning. But what was he doing allied with Hitler? And then at Hitler's throat. And here the world learned a lesson about totalitarianism, that there is this eerie similarity between extremist movements, even if they are formally on one side of the right and on one side of the left. including their willingness to make cynical deals and their willingness to betray one another. In fact, their complete disregard of anything resembling conventional morality. In some sense, that's the foundation on which both stood. And thus it is that they would make common cause against the West and then leap at one another's throats. And don't be fooled. Stalin would have jumped on Hitler when the moment was right. There's no question that that alliance would have continued on happily if it weren't for the unfortunate Operation Barbarossa. And by the way, this notion that Stalin trusted Hitler, when the Nazi-Soviet Pact was signed, Stalin toasted Hitler. And he said, I know how much the German nation loves its Führer. You think, okay, well, he was starry-eyed, he was deceived. You know, that's one of those he's an extraordinary man quotations. He didn't say, I know that the German nation loves its Führer. He said, I know how much it loves its Führer. I think that was very much Stalin being tongue-in-cheek, a cunning man with layers and layers of cunning. His regime was also mind-bogglingly evil. The Soviets were terribly unprepared, partly because of the purge of the Red Army. And a classic story, Marshal Tukhachevsky, who was chief of the Army Chief of Staff, was arrested and shot after a one-day trial. 6 of the 8 officers who were judges in his trial were also themselves subsequently shot. But Stalin was very serious about eliminating the bourgeoisie, and he was trying to buy time in order to carry out this terribly evil plan, just as Hitler was trying to buy time to overcome the West so he wouldn't have to fight a two-front war, so that he could then finish off the Soviets, which he very nearly succeeded in doing. So when you look at the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, you thank goodness that it didn't succeed, while cursing the fact that Stalin's regime survived. But we did need them as allies. It was suitable to take them as allies, because this really was an amazing stew of cunning, of stupidity, and of massive evil. And, on our side, also of a hard-headed acceptance of geopolitical necessity. That all was triggered on June 22nd, 1941, when Hitler attacked his erstwhile ally, the Soviet Union. If you're enjoying these commentaries, please visit my website, that's johnrobson.ca, make a pledge to help sustain my work, and of course, keep watching The Rebel, keep subscribing to The Rebel for the news and commentary you won't get anywhere else.